Well, Professor Ashworth, why don't you tell us how you got into playing the trombone?
I sure will, but first of all, good morning. Thanks for including me in this excellent project with all the great players that you have on bone and rhythm. It's been a real treat. My history on trombone, I think, probably goes back to me listening to recordings of my parents' records. For you kids, those are pre-CDs, black vinyl things. My parents had the usual phonograph and a cabinet full of those, and they were raised in the big band era, which meant I grew up listening to Jack Jenny, Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller, lots of Jack Teagarden, a little bit of Bob Havens, playing with Al Hurt. So I was really treated to some sort of the classic history of trombone, also along with Teagarden with Louis Armstrong and his own bands, Kid Ory and some other folks. So I've got everything sorted through trad or Dixie. Didn't quite make it up into bebop until I got into high school. And so I was really firmly rooted in trad jazz and swing coming up to that decisive day in 5th grade. But ironically, I really wanted to play trumpet because my Uncle Bill was a great trad jazz and swing trumpet player and a band director and freelance player up in Yuba City, California, where all my dad's kinfolk are from. They were in the lumber industry. So I really was keen to play trumpet. So I went to Mr. Southwick, the band director, beginning of 5th grade. They didn't do pre-testing back then. It wasn't nearly so sophisticated. You just got in a line and told him what you wanted to play. And I said, I want to play trumpet. And he said, well, Tom, that's too bad because number one, we're out of trumpets, and luckily you have big lips, so you should play trombone. And I've heard that excuse has been used around the country for years because it's not uncommon for a lot more kids to want to play the higher instruments than the low brass. In my case, turned out to be a pretty good choice.
I would say so.
So that's how it worked out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just did an interview with Dave Graff, and he originally wanted to play flute, and his band director wouldn't let him play flute, so he ended up on trombone.
Right. It's an old story.
Yeah. So both you and I have a connection of having attended the University of North Texas. I certainly have some stories. Do you have any stories from your time there that maybe affected your development on trombone?
Well, there were some really good teachers when I first got there. The late, great Leon Brown was a real grandfather type of a person, very warm, very kind. Not too much into either jazz or orchestral, but just a really solid teacher of fundamentals on the trombone, and that was good for me. My undergrad teacher, Larry Sutherland at Fresno State, was sort of the opposite. Didn't really have too much time for etudes and the like, and we tended to work a lot on chamber music. He was especially interested in having me transpose, say, a Koprosh horn duet to a different key every week. So we'd start in B flat, C, E flat, and D. Never got around to A, but covered everything else. And solo repertoire. So that was good for me. And then when I got to North Texas, just to sort of clean some things up and to learn some more of that sort of pedagogical repertoire, that was Leon Brown, and that certainly was good for me. I ended up taking 3 years off just to freelance around Dallas, which had started when I was at North Texas. One thing I remember about North Texas in particular was just the size and depth of the pool. We had 97 trombone players that fall, and 30 of us are grad students, and there were 3 of us full-time TAs teaching 15 hours a week and 2 half-time TAs, kind of a bumper crop of trombones those years. So I remember just the size of it, truly swimming with the sharks in a big pool. And that's not unlike moving to a big city and trying to break into the freelance. The cream does rise to the top, there's just more of it. And so the competition is there. I remember that. I think that probably my fondest memories teaching-wise was working with the late Vern Kagarice, who was a real gentleman and a fantastic and very, it's a good word, insightful type teacher. After 3 years of freelancing in Dallas, playing pretty much 100% on my Williams 6 jazz horn and a Bach 9 mouthpiece, safe to say my bighorn chops had gone away. And it was a pretty rugged semester or two to get back to where I could play the 42B and a 5G and make it sound appropriate. And he, I'm sure, sat through some truly grueling lessons, and so I really appreciated his patience. I also remember the way that he took time before I was even a student to meet with me and talk about the realities of the college job market and how to prepare for it, and even to the point of really helping me get my and before electronic portfolios, my resume and everything else together, cover letters. And so he was instrumental, to say the very least, in rehabbing my bighorn chops and steering me into what's been a very enjoyable college teaching career.
That's fantastic. Well, I had also had the pleasure of getting to work with Vern Kagaris and Jan Kagaris and also Dennis Bubert. One person that was very helpful for me when I was down at North Texas was Tony Baker, who was towards the end of my undergrad and into my master's at North Texas. And he's actually the one that's another connection we have. He's the one that brought me up here to the University of Minnesota to study with you.
Right. Tony, safe to say, was at the very top, small handful of versatile trombonists I've had the pleasure of working with. You are also in that same small handful of players, and been very fortunate to have some very versatile and teachable students up here. And like Tony came here from, I believe, Central Arkansas. I think it's safe to say we wouldn't have been on his map, but he was competing in a national solo competition, and a pianist colleague of mine at the U of M, Becky Shockley, said, I just heard this kid, you got to call him. So I called Tony, and we sort of hit it off, and he came up for a trip, and I think he liked the slightly more, let's just say, urban setting than where he was in Central Arkansas. I think he liked the idea of working with somebody that could address the classical and the jazz aspects of the horn, and was interesting. Tony, when he first got here, was really interested in pursuing the orchestral thing, which he's doing very successfully now as a regular member of the Dallas Opera Orchestra. Fantastic classical orchestra, solo player, chamber musician, and a killer jazz player too. So it was interesting to see the sort of the transition with Tony. He says, I've got a family, I've got kids. I like the idea of calling my own shots a little bit more, with a similar type of security, you might say, and benefits of a full-time college job, a full-time orchestra job. So I think it was a really good transition for him. And like me, he still got to be involved in the orchestral end of things. But Tony, I think, has developed into one of the really top and most versatile trombone teachers and players in this country. So I'm really glad you got a chance to work with him.
That was fantastic. And of course, coming up here was a fantastic move. One of the best decisions I ever made, getting to work with you. I had a lot of the similar things I was looking for in a teacher as Tony, and getting the opportunity to work on classical as well as jazz will really refine some of my musical sensibilities, and at the same time to work on changes, and you really gave me the freedom to build up many sides of my playing.
Well, I like to tell students, life is long, it's good to have options. You never know when the market you're in is going to change. You'll never know when you'll go in and out of style, in terms of your playing or personality. There are just all sorts of things that determine why people are employable. And it's so nice to have those options. It really is. And it was certainly a very fortuitous time, because one of my other great all-around, probably I'd have to say, the finest all-around jazz and classical trombonist I've ever had in Minnesota, Victor Barranco from North Pole, Alaska. Really, North Pole, Alaska. Was just finishing his undergrad and went to North Texas to do his master's. And you came up here with the exact skill set and personality and knowledge of the industry to step into a lot of that good work that Victor had done for years, including working with one of my favorite jazz trombonists, David Graff, in a lot of different venues. So, you can move to town, but if you don't have the chops and the personality and the knowledge base, you're not going to get that work. But you certainly did.
Thank you. And of course, the title of this composition is The Mentor, because not only were you a mentor to me, but you were a mentor to my previous professor, Tony Baker.
Yeah, being a teacher is one thing. One of the things that I really try to emphasize in my teaching is, number one, into practice. You got to treat it like a full-time job when you're a student, if you want the luxury of having it as a full-time job when you're out in the real world. So when to practice, how to practice effectively, what to practice, I think, is about the easiest thing. Anybody that has a file cabinet full of etudes and solos and orchestra excerpts and, Abersol can give you an idea of what to practice. But I think the key for most students is how to practice. You know, just strategy, whether it's working on changes with something like band in the box, breaking it down into key areas, changing the tempo, et cetera, how to practice. And the same thing in classical music. There are just so many strategies that I think can be effectively employed to really clean up some of the rough edges in a player's articulation, increase range without thinking of it as a strength issue. And just to be clear, I don't think of trombone as a strength instrument. No more than, say, having the knowledge of the basic muscle masses of support, the mechanics of how an embouchure really does work effectively, and then in essence, figuring out the sounds you want to make, whether it's classical or jazz, and the type of air stream, in other words, the amount of air and the speed at which it's moving that it takes to create that sound. And once you really understand that magic formula, you can forget about the chops. In fact, you should. You should play from your sound image and the correct airstream, and not from the chops. It's when you play from how the chops feel, or even worse, how you perceive their feeling, that bad things start to happen. Yeah, so that's, to me, is one of the biggest things about being a mentor, is making sure people understand how to practice. And then, you know, a big part of mentoring is, you know, sort of telling people how to prepare for different aspects of the music industry. And you've gotten into aspects of the music industry I've never touched, including all of this wonderful technology that you're using in a very artistic way to create these great products, which I'm sure will be very successful.
Thank you. What do you say we go record this tune?
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
Thanks, Scott.